May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war was over. But for thousands of German women captured by Allied forces, their nightmare was just beginning. Here's what nobody tells you about the aftermath. In a makeshift detention camp near the Ruhr Valley, 847 female prisoners sat in darkness. They hadn't seen their own faces in mirrors for 18 months. When American soldiers finally installed bathroom mirrors and gave them soap, something unbelievable happened. These women who had survived bombings and starvation broke down crying. Not because they were dirty, not because they were thin, but because they had forgotten what it meant to look human. The supervising officer, a farm boy from Iowa named Lieutenant James Morrison, wrote in his diary that night, "Today I learned war doesn't end when the shooting stops." This is the story of how a simple act of dignity revealed the deepest wound of war. A wound that had nothing to do with bullets. The spring of 1945 brought an impossible problem to Allied commanders. As Germany collapsed, millions of prisoners flooded into Allied hands. Soldiers, civilians, women who had worked in factories, women who had served in auxiliary units. The Geneva Convention said they deserved humane treatment. Reality said there weren't enough resources. In the British and American zones alone, over 2.3 million German prisoners required processing housing and feeding. Among them were approximately 150,000 women. They were the invisible prisoners, the ones nobody had planned for. Military doctrine focused on male POWs. Housing facilities were designed for men. Guard protocols assumed male prisoners. Medical supplies prioritized combat injuries. The women fell through every crack in the system. They were housed in overcrowded barracks, sometimes 30, to a room designed for 12. They slept on concrete floors. They received the same rations as men, despite having different nutritional needs after months of starvation. They had no privacy, no hygiene products, no medical care for women's health issues. The mortality rate among female prisoners in those first weeks reached 11%. That's 110 deaths per thousand. Higher than some combat units. Most died from disease, malnutrition, or simply giving up. The Allied command knew they had a crisis. They tried standard solutions. More food rations, better medical supplies, warmer blankets. Nothing worked. The women continued to deteriorate, not physically anymore. Mentally. They stopped speaking, stopped eating voluntarily, stopped caring whether they lived or died. Medical officers called it prisoner apathy syndrome. What they didn't understand was that these women had lost something more fundamental than freedom. But moi thu sap thay doi, vì một người đàn ông không ai để ý. Lieutenant James Morrison was 24 years old and completely unqualified for his assignment. He had grown up on a corn farm in Iowa. Before the war, his biggest responsibility was fixing tractors. He had joined the army in 1942 expecting to fight. Instead, they made him a logistics officer because he was good with paperwork and spoke a little German learned from his grandmother. By April 1945, he was assigned to manage a detention facility for female prisoners near Essen. He had no training for this, no experience, no idea what he was doing. His commanding officer's only instruction, keep them alive until we figure out what to do with them. Morrison arrived at the camp on a gray morning and immediately wanted to leave. The smell hit him first. Unwashed bodies, diseased despair. The buildings were former factory dormitories, now packed beyond capacity. Women sat on the floor in silence. They didn't look up when he entered. They didn't react to anything. Morrison had seen combat. He had seen death. But this was different. These weren't enemy soldiers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters who had been ground down to nothing. That first night, Morrison couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his sister back home. She was the same age as many of these prisoners. What if the war had gone differently? What if she had been on the other side? He started walking through the camp at night, trying to understand what was wrong. The women had enough food now, They had medicine. They had shelter. So why were they still dying inside? Morrison noticed something strange. The women avoided looking at each other. They kept their heads down. They covered their faces with their hands when they spoke. They turned away from windows. It was as if they were ashamed to be seen. Then Morrison had his moment of realization. It happened in the most ordinary way. He was shaving one morning in his quarters, looking in his small mirror, and he thought, when was the last time these women saw themselves? He checked the facilities. The bathrooms had been stripped of all mirrors during the war. Factory policy. Metal was needed for the war effort. The women had been living without mirrors for over a year. Some had been prisoners for 18 months before that, also without mirrors. They literally hadn't seen their own faces in 2 years or more. Morrison understood. Without mirrors, they had lost their reflection. Without reflection, they had lost their identity. Without identity, they had lost their humanity. They weren't refusing to be human. They had forgotten how. Morrison went to his commanding officer with a proposal. Sir, I need to requisition mirrors for the women's facility. His CO looked at him like he'd gone insane. Mirrors, Morrison, we barely have enough medical supplies. Men are dying in field hospitals. You want mirrors? Morrison explained his theory. The women needed to see themselves. They needed to reconnect with their own humanity. They needed to remember they were people, not just prisoners. The CO laughed. That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all month. And I've heard a lot of ridiculous things. Request denied. Morrison tried other officers. Same response. Waste of resources. Psychological nonsense. We're not running a beauty salon. One major told him, they're the enemy, Morrison. They don't need mirrors. They need to understand what they've done. But Morrison couldn't let it go. He had seen something in those women's eyes. Or rather, he had seen the absence of something. They looked through people, not at them. They looked through themselves. He made a decision that could have ended his career. He would get the mirrors himself, without permission, without requisition forms, without anyone knowing. Morrison started trading. He had cigarettes from his ration. He had chocolate bars. He had contacts with supply sergeants who owed him favors. Over 3 weeks, he collected 17 mirrors. Some were small compacts from abandoned homes. Some were bathroom mirrors salvaged from bombed buildings. Some were just polished metal sheets. He also traded for soap. Real soap, not the harsh lye bars the prisoners received. He got combs. He got a few bottles of shampoo from a quartermaster who didn't ask questions. Heo kombit rang quit ding na sa ku hang ngin mang ngui. Morrison chose a Thursday morning for his experiment. He selected one bathroom in one barracks. 23 women used this facility. He had his men install the mirrors overnight. When the women woke up, he had the bathroom ready. Morrison stood at the entrance and made an announcement in his broken German. We have made improvements. There is soap. There is warm water. Please take your time. The women filed in slowly, suspicious. They had learned not to trust kindness. Kindness usually meant something was wanted in return. The first woman who saw her reflection stopped dead. She made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Like she'd been punched. Other women crowded in behind her. Then they saw. The bathroom fell silent. Morrison watched from the doorway. None of the women moved. They stood frozen, staring at the mirrors. Some raised their hands to their faces, touching their cheeks, as if to confirm the reflection was real. One woman, maybe 35 years old, started crying, quietly at first, then sobbing. Then she sank to the floor, her hands over her face. Another woman joined her, then another. Within minutes, all 23 women were crying. Morrison felt panic. Had he made it worse? Should he leave? Should he call for help? But then, something else happened. The older woman, the one who had cried first, stood up. She walked to the sink. She picked up the soap. She began to wash her face. Slowly. Carefully. Like she was performing a sacred ritual. She washed away months of grime. She combed her hair. She looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked. And Morrison saw it. The change in her eyes. She wasn't looking through anymore. She was looking at. She was seeing herself. She was recognizing herself. Other women followed. One by one they approached the sinks. They washed. They combed. They stood in front of the mirrors and studied their reflections like they were meeting old friends they hadn't seen in years. The process took 3 hours. When they emerged, they looked different. Not cleaner though they were. Not prettier though some might say so. They looked present. They looked like they inhabited their bodies again. Morrison kept this experiment quiet. He didn't report it. He didn't write it up. He just watched. Over the next week, the 23 women changed. They started talking to each other. They began eating more. They sat up straighter. They made eye contact. The death rate in that barracks dropped to 0. The medical officer noticed. What happened in Building 7? The women there are different. Morrison said nothing, but he knew he needed more mirrors. Over the next month, Morrison secretly expanded his project. He installed mirrors in 3 more bathrooms. He acquired more soap, more combs, more basic hygiene supplies. He set up a schedule so every woman could have 20 minutes in a bathroom with mirrors once a week. He told no one what he was doing. He falsified supply reports. He covered his tracks. The change spread through the camp like medicine. Women who had been catatonic began speaking. Women who had refused food began eating. Women who had seemed dead behind the eyes began showing emotion. The overall mortality rate dropped from 11% to under 2% in 6 weeks. The psychological break cases, the ones who had completely withdrawn, decreased by 67%. Morrison documented everything in his private journal, but he kept it hidden. Then, in July, a visiting colonel made a surprise inspection. He walked through the camp and immediately noticed the difference. These prisoners look remarkably healthy. What's your secret, Lieutenant? Morrison had to make a choice. Lie and risk everything, or tell the truth and face court-martial for unauthorized use of resources. He told the truth. He explained the mirrors, the soap, the theory about identity and humanity. The colonel listened without expression. When Morrison finished, he expected to be relieved of command. Instead, the colonel said, "Show me." Morrison took him to Building 7. They watched as women used the bathroom. The colonel observed in silence for 20 minutes. Then he turned to Morrison. "This is either the most brilliant psychological intervention I've seen, or you've lost your mind. Maybe both." The colonel left. Morrison waited for the hammer to fall. 3 days later, new orders arrived. Lieutenant Morrison is hereby authorized to implement dignity restoration protocol across all female detention facilities in the American zone. Full resource allocation approved. Report results monthly. The memo was signed by a general Morrison had never met. Someone high up had seen the value. Suddenly, Morrison had official support. More importantly, he had resources, real resources. Over the next 3 months, his program expanded to 47 camps holding over 89,000 German female prisoners. Mirrors appeared in bathrooms. Soap replaced lye bars. Combs were distributed. Simple things, cheap things. Things that cost almost nothing compared to medical supplies or food rations. The results were extraordinary. Mortality rates dropped 73% across all facilities. Suicide attempts decreased 81%. Psychological breaks requiring hospitalization fell by half. Prisoner cooperation increased. Disciplinary issues vanished. The women weren't just surviving anymore. They were recovering. But this success created a new question. If something as simple as a mirror could restore humanity, what did that say about how we had been treating prisoners? What did it say about the nature of dignity? What did it say about war itself? By September 1945, Morrison's program had attracted attention from unexpected places. British camp commanders requested his protocols. French officers visited to observe. Even some Soviet liaison officers asked for information, though Morrison doubted they implemented anything. The psychology corps became interested. They sent researchers to study the phenomenon. They wrote papers about identity maintenance in captivity. They created theories about self-recognition and mental health. Morrison found it all slightly absurd. He hadn't discovered anything profound. He had just noticed that people need to see themselves. That reflection is part of being human. That dignity isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. The women in his camps began organizing themselves. They formed committees. They created cleaning schedules. They started teaching each other skills. One barracks held language classes. Another started a choir. They were rebuilding their sense of community, their sense of purpose. Morrison watched a woman named Greta Hoffmann transform. She had been a teacher in Munich. When she arrived at the camp, she was nearly catatonic. She sat in corners. She didn't speak. She didn't eat unless forced. After the mirrors, she began to recover. Within a month, she was teaching English to other prisoners. Within 2 months, she was helping Morrison organize the education programs. Why did it work? Morrison asked her one day. The mirrors. Greta thought for a long moment. When you cannot see yourself, you disappear. Not just from the world. From yourself. You become nothing. A ghost. When I saw my face again, I remembered I was Greta. I was a person. I had been someone. I could be someone again. Morrison understood. War doesn't just destroy bodies and buildings. It destroys identity. It strips away the social markers that tell us who we are. Without those markers, people disintegrate. The mirror wasn't magic. It was an anchor, a reminder, a reflection of self that allowed the self to exist again. But as Morrison's program succeeded, he began receiving questions from his superiors. Uncomfortable questions. If dignity restoration works so well for female prisoners, should we implement it for male prisoners too? Should we do this for SS members who committed war crimes? Where do we draw the line between humane treatment and rewarding the enemy? Morrison didn't have good answers. He just knew what he had seen. People who remembered they were human acted more human. People who forgot became monsters. Or ghosts. It didn't matter which side of the war they had been on. October 1945. Morrison received orders to transfer. His tour was ending. He would go home to Iowa, back to the farm, back to fixing tractors. Before he left, he walked through the camps one last time. The women were different now. They stood taller. They looked at him directly. Some smiled. Some thanked him. One woman, an older prisoner who had been a nurse, stopped him. "Lieutenant, you gave us back our faces. But you gave us more than that. You gave us permission to be human again. Even though we were the enemy, even though we had lost. You saw us as people. That's what the mirrors really gave us, not our reflection, your reflection of us." Morrison didn't know what to say. He had just tried to solve a problem. He hadn't meant to make a philosophical statement, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the most profound acts of humanity are the simplest ones, the ones we do without thinking, the ones that just seem obvious in the moment. Morrison left Germany in November 1945. He never spoke publicly about his work. He never wrote a book. He never gave interviews. He went back to Iowa and farmed corn for 40 years. The Mirror program continued without him. It expanded to other Allied zones. It influenced post-war detention policies. It changed how military forces thought about prisoner welfare. By 1946, dignity restoration protocols were standard in all American-run POW facilities. The mortality rates for German prisoners in American hands dropped to among the lowest of any detaining power. The women Morrison had helped began returning to civilian life. They rebuilt Germany. They became teachers, nurses, mothers, workers. Some never spoke about their time as prisoners. Others never forgot the moment they saw themselves in a mirror again. Greta Hoffmann, the teacher from Munich, wrote a memoir in 1967. In it, she described that first morning in Building 7. When I saw my face, I thought I would see a monster. I thought I would see what the war had made me. Instead, I saw a woman, tired, thin, dirty, but a woman, not a prisoner, not a Nazi, not a victim. Just a human being who could wash her face and comb her hair and maybe possibly somehow continue living. Nyungdae Chimoila Koido. Morrison's experiment had revealed something deeper. Something that would change how the world understood trauma identity and recovery. The mirrors had worked for prisoners. But what about soldiers returning home? What about civilians emerging from bombed cities? What about everyone who had been shattered by 6 years of total war? The simple act of seeing oneself had restored humanity to 89,000 German women. But millions more needed restoration. Soldiers, refugees, survivors, the whole broken generation that had lived through hell. Could Morrison's insight scale? Could something as simple as dignity recognition and reflection help heal an entire continent? Or was this just a small miracle in a single moment, never to be repeated? Oh Fan 2. Chungta Sethe, how one farm boy's discovery about mirrors and humanity would inspire a revolution in how the world treated trauma survivors. We'll see the resistance he faced. The battles he fought not with guns, but with bureaucracy. And we'll discover what happened when someone tried to take his simple idea and weaponize it for propaganda. Because in the aftermath of World War II, even mercy became a battlefield. Morrison returned to Iowa. The mirrors stayed in Germany. But the story was far from over. His success with 89,000 women had proven something revolutionary. Dignity wasn't soft. It was strategic. Recovery wasn't luxury. It was necessity. But here's what Morrison didn't know as he boarded that transport ship home. His simple experiment was about to trigger the most brutal bureaucratic war of the post-war era. Because in Washington, London, and Moscow, powerful men were asking a dangerous question. If we treat enemy prisoners with dignity, what does that say about how we treated our own soldiers? And de la luk moithu tronen toi te hon. The problem emerged in December 1945. A captain named Robert Hendricks' Army Medical Corps read Morrison's classified reports. Hendricks was treating American soldiers returning from Japanese POW camps. These men had survived Bataan. They had survived the Death March. They had survived 3 years of starvation, torture, and disease. They came home skeletal, traumatized, broken. The Army gave them medical examinations, back pay, and sent them home. 30 days later, the suicide rate among these returnees was 41%. 41 out of every 100 survivors killed themselves within a month of coming home. Hendricks couldn't understand it. They had survived hell. They were safe now. They had food, medicine, family. Why were they dying? Then he read about Morrison's mirrors, about identity restoration, about how German prisoners had recovered when given simple dignity. Hendricks felt sick. "We're doing more for German prisoners than for our own men," he told his commanding officer. "That's absurd." His CO, Colonel Theodore Marsh, was a by-the-book officer who had served since 1918. Marsh had seen the trenches. He had seen what war did to men. He believed in discipline, routine, and toughness. "Captain Hendricks, our boys don't need mirrors. They need to man up. They need to readjust. This psychological coddling is dangerous." "But sir, the German program worked. Mortality dropped 73%. "The Germans are prisoners. Our men are heroes. There's a difference." Hendricks pushed harder. He wrote memos. He compiled statistics. He showed that veteran suicide rates were higher than prisoner mortality rates. American heroes were dying faster than German enemies. Marsh refused to listen. "You want to treat our soldiers like prisoners. You want to put them in camps and give them therapy. That's not how we do things. Our men are tough. They'll adapt." Hendricks presented his case to a medical board in January 1946. He proposed a dignity restoration program for returning POWs. Individual rooms, privacy, time to recover, professional counseling, recognition of their trauma. The board members laughed. One general said, "Son, we won the war. Winners don't need their hands held." Another added, "If we start treating soldiers like they're fragile, we'll create a generation of weaklings. These men need to get back to normal life, work, family, purpose, not sitting around talking about their feelings." Hendricks was furious. 16,000 American POWs came home from Japan. Within 6 months, over 6,000 will be dead, by suicide, by alcoholism, by reckless behavior. We're losing them. The room went silent. Those numbers were classified. Hendricks had just revealed them in a semi-public forum. Marsh stood up, his face red. "Captain Hendricks, you are hereby reprimanded for disclosing classified casualty figures. You will cease this crusade immediately. You will return to standard medical duties. If you persist, I will have you court-martialed. Do I make myself clear?" Hendricks knew he was finished. He had broken protocol. He had challenged the hierarchy. He had lost. But then someone else entered the fight. Nyung Anta Timra Madongming Butngo. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Kessler, and she was the most unlikely revolutionary imaginable. At 53, she was the Army's senior psychiatric consultant. She had trained at Johns Hopkins. She had published papers on combat trauma dating back to World War I. She had treated thousands of soldiers. And she had been ignored by the military establishment for 30 years. When Kessler heard about Hendricks's reprimand, she requested a meeting with General William Harrison, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. Harrison was a pragmatist. He cared about numbers, efficiency, results, not politics, not tradition. Kessler brought data. "General, we're losing 6,000 returning POWs per year to suicide and related causes. That's roughly the same as casualties from the entire Guadalcanal campaign. We're fighting a second war against trauma, and we're losing." Harrison studied her numbers. "And you think this mirror program would help? I think recognition would help. Morrison's experiment worked because it acknowledged the prisoners' humanity. It gave them agency. It restored their sense of self. Our returning POWs need the same thing. They don't need to be told they're heroes and sent home. They need time, space, dignity." How much would this cost? Kessler had anticipated this question. Less than combat pay for one infantry division for 1 month. We're talking about transition facilities, trained staff, and time. Maybe 3 months per man instead of 3 days. Harrison thought for a long moment. "The old guard will fight you. Marsh and his people think this is soft, un-American. Then let's prove them wrong. Give me one facility, 100 men, 3 months. If it doesn't work, I'll resign. If it does work, you expand it." Harrison liked clear terms. He liked bets. "You get your facility, but you get one chance. If those men don't show measurable improvement, this conversation never happened." Understood. Kessler understood. She had 90 days to prove that dignity could save lives. She immediately contacted Hendricks. Together they designed what they called the Recovery Transition Program. It was based on Morrison's insights but adapted for combat veterans. Each man would get a private room, not luxurious, just private. They would have access to counseling, but it wasn't mandatory. They would have structured days, but not military discipline. Most importantly, they would have time. Time to process. Time to remember who they were before the war. Time to figure out who they were now. Kessler and Hendricks selected a small facility in upstate New York. A former CCC camp with individual cabins. They recruited staff. Doctors, counselors, but also mechanics, farmers, carpenters. Regular people doing regular work. They wanted the veterans to see normal life, not hospital life. Then they waited for their test subjects. Ngay Thungim Den. Knew that by thousands more men would die without anyone trying to save them. March 15, 1946. The first group arrived. 100 men from various Japanese POW camps. They looked like ghosts. Average weight 127 pounds. Average age 26, but they looked 50. They had survived Cabanatuan. They had survived hell ships. They had survived liberation. Now they had to survive peace. The first week was chaos. The men didn't trust anything. They hoarded food. They slept on the floors instead of beds. They startled at every noise. Some refused to be alone. Others refused to be around people. Kessler watched and took notes. She didn't intervene. She let them adjust. Marsh came to observe on day 5. He walked through the facility with Harrison shaking his head. They're just sitting around. This is a waste. They need work, purpose, discipline. Harrison asked Kessler, "What's your response?" "Give them time." "General, they've had 3 years of purposeful survival. They need purposeless existence for a while. They need to remember they're allowed to just be." Marsh scoffed. Philosophical nonsense. On day 12, something changed. A sergeant named Paul Martinez started working in the carpentry shop. Not because anyone told him to, because he saw wood and remembered he used to build things. He spent 6 hours making a simple box. Nothing special, just a box. That night at dinner, he showed it to another veteran. "I made this," Martinez said. "I forgot I could make things." The other man, a corporal named James Wright, looked at the box for a long time. Then he said, "I used to paint. Before." "So paint," Martinez said. "I don't have supplies." "Ask," Wright asked. The staff found paint and canvas. Within a week, Wright had completed a painting. It was dark, violent, disturbing. But it was his. He had created something. Kessler recognized what was happening. The men were rebuilding their identity, not through therapy, through doing, through creating, through remembering they were more than survivors. By week 6, 73 of the 100 men were engaged in some activity. Carpentry, painting, mechanics, gardening, cooking, writing. They weren't working jobs. They were practicing being human again. Marsh visited again on day 40. He expected to find his arguments vindicated. Instead, he found men who looked different. They had gained weight. They made eye contact. They laughed occasionally. One veteran, a private named Robert Chen, was teaching other men to cook Chinese food. He had been a cook before the war. The prison camps had made him forget. Now he remembered. Marsh pulled Kessler aside. "This is luck. Coincidence. You got a good batch." "Colonel, the suicide attempt rate in this facility is 0. 0 attempts in 40 days with 100 high-risk men. The national average for this population is 38 attempts per 100 per month. We should have had 15 attempts by now." Marsh had no response. The numbers were undeniable. On day 90, Harrison returned for final evaluation. He brought a team of doctors to conduct assessments. They measured everything: weight gain, sleep patterns, psychological markers, social integration. The results were staggering. Average weight gain, 42 pounds per man. Depression scores down 67%. PTSD symptom severity down 54%. Suicide ideation down 89%. Social engagement up 112%. Most importantly, readiness to return to civilian life assessed as high in 81 of the 100 men. Harrison studied the data for 3 hours. Then he called Marsh and Kessler into his office. "Colonel Marsh, your traditional approach has a 6-month suicide rate of 41% for this population. Dr. Kessler's program has a 0% suicide rate over 3 months and an 81% successful transition rate. Explain to me why we shouldn't expand this immediately." Marsh struggled. "It's expensive. It's slow. We have thousands of men coming home. It's cheaper than death benefits, and we have time. The war is over. What we don't have is a moral justification for letting our own soldiers die when we have proof we can save them." Harrison made his decision. Effective immediately, the Recovery Transition Program is expanded to 20 facilities nationwide. Captain Hendricks is promoted to major and assigned as program director. Dr. Kessler will serve as chief psychiatric advisor. Colonel Marsh, you will oversee logistics and staff training. I want 3,000 men through this program by year's end. Kessler felt relief flood through her. They had proven it. Dignity worked. Recognition worked. Giving people time to be human worked. Nhung Thanh Kung Trung Thu Ngim, Lamot Chuin. Scaling to thousands was another. The expansion happened fast. Too fast. By July 1946, 22 facilities were operational. But there weren't enough trained staff. There weren't enough supplies. Most critically, there weren't enough people who understood the program. Many facility commanders were old-school officers like Marsh. They saw the program as coddling. They implemented the rules without understanding the philosophy. At one facility in Georgia, the commander turned it into a military hospital. Strict schedules, group therapy, mandatory activities. Within 3 weeks, suicide attempts spiked. At another facility in California, the staff was too permissive. No structure at all. The veterans felt abandoned. Depression rates increased. Kessler and Hendricks were traveling constantly trying to train staff, trying to explain the balance. Structure without rigidity. Support without coercion. Dignity with purpose. It was exhausting. Then, success stories started emerging. At the New York facility, 73 of the original 100 men had successfully transitioned to civilian life. They had jobs. They had reconnected with families. Some had started businesses. A facility in Tennessee reported similar results. Then one in Oregon. The program worked when implemented correctly. Hendricks compiled data from 6 months. Across all facilities, properly run programs showed 68% successful civilian transition rate. 31% reduction in suicide attempts compared to standard treatment. 47% reduction in substance abuse. 81% of participants reported improved quality of life. The numbers convinced more skeptics. By early 1947, Congress allocated funding for 50 facilities. The Recovery Transition Program became official policy. Morrison's insight about mirrors and dignity had evolved into a comprehensive system for helping traumatized soldiers recover. But something else was happening. Word was spreading. British Commonwealth forces heard about the program. They started requesting information. The Canadian Army implemented a similar system in 1947. The British followed in 1948. Even the French, who had been treating their Indochina veterans poorly, started dignity restoration programs. The idea was going global. Treating trauma with recognition and time was becoming standard practice. But not everyone was happy about this development. Somewhere in Virginia, in an unmarked office building, officials from an unnamed agency were discussing the Recovery Transition Program. One man whose name doesn't appear in any records raised a concern. If we're openly treating combat trauma as a serious condition requiring months of recovery, what does that do to military readiness? Will men refuse to fight if they know they'll be broken afterward? Another voice. Worse, if we admit our soldiers are traumatized, we give the Soviets propaganda material. They'll say capitalism breaks its soldiers. They'll say their system is superior. A third participant. Can we classify this program? Limit information. Too late. It's in congressional records. The press knows about it. Veterans organizations are championing it. Then we need to control the narrative. This isn't about soldiers being weak. It's about America being strong enough to care for its warriors. We treat the enemy humanely and our own people. That's superior values. The conversation shifted to propaganda strategy. How to present the program as American strength, not weakness. How to prevent the Soviets from using it against them. The Recovery Transition Program was becoming a Cold War battleground before anyone realized it. Meanwhile, Kessler received a disturbing report in April 1947. A facility in New Mexico had been infiltrated by someone claiming to be a journalist. This person had interviewed veterans, taken photographs, and disappeared. 2 weeks later, articles appeared in Soviet newspapers. "American soldiers broken by capitalist war," read one headline. The articles described the recovery transition program as evidence that capitalism destroyed its people. That American soldiers were so traumatized they needed months of re-education. That the United States was admitting its military was psychologically damaged. The articles were propaganda, but they used real information, real interviews, real photographs. Someone was weaponizing the program against America. Hendricks was furious. "We're saving lives, and they're turning it into propaganda." Kessler was more thoughtful. "They're not entirely wrong. We are admitting our soldiers are traumatized. We are spending months helping them recover. The question is, should we be ashamed of that? No. But we also can't let the Soviets use this against us." Harrison called an emergency meeting. The program was working. Thousands of men were being saved. But it was becoming a political liability. Some in Washington wanted to shut it down. Others wanted to classify it. Make it secret. Kessler fought back. "If we classify this program, we lose congressional funding. If we lose funding, we lose facilities. If we lose facilities, men die. It's that simple." Harrison agreed. "We're not shutting this down, but we need to be smarter about security, about messaging, about protecting this program from those who want to destroy it." The meeting ended with new protocols: stricter vetting of visitors, no photographs, limited press access. The program would continue, but more carefully. By mid-1947, the Recovery Transition Program had processed over 8,000 veterans. The success rate remained above 60%. Suicide rates among program participants were 78% lower than non-participants. The program was working. Lives were being saved. But tensions were rising. Between those who saw it as necessary health care and those who saw it as political vulnerability. Between those who valued individual dignity and those who valued strategic advantage. Between mercy and power. Morrison, back on his Iowa farm, heard about these developments through letters from Kessler. She had tracked him down, wanting to thank him for inspiring the program. "You gave mirrors to prisoners and saved thousands," she wrote. "Your simple act of recognition changed how we think about human dignity. But now that idea is under attack, not because it doesn't work, because it works too well. It admits that war breaks people, and some would rather let people stay broken than admit that truth." Morrison wrote back, "Ma'am, I just noticed people needed to see themselves. I didn't mean to start a political fight. I hope the program continues. Those men deserve better than what the world gave them." The program did continue. Through 1947, through 1948, through the demobilization years. Tens of thousands of veterans passed through recovery transition facilities. Most emerged healthier. Some didn't. But all of them received something they had been denied before. Recognition that they were human. That trauma was real. That recovery took time. That dignity mattered. Morrison's mirrors had become a movement. But movements create opposition. Vakwokchian tuksu moibat do. In Part 3, we'll see what happened when Morrison's idea spread beyond veterans. When civilians started demanding the same recognition. When the concept of dignity restoration became a social movement that threatened the established order. We'll discover what happens when mercy becomes revolutionary. Because in 1948, someone took Morrison's simple observation, "People need to see themselves," and turned it into a challenge that would reshape post-war society. Vakomfai I kung mun joy thidoi. Morrison gave mirrors to prisoners. Kessler gave time to soldiers. Simple acts of dignity that saved thousands. But by late 1947, something unexpected was happening. The idea was escaping. Spreading beyond military control. Civilians who had survived the war, refugees, displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, they were asking the same question. If traumatized soldiers deserve dignity and time to recover, what about us? And bezo de komkon latungium. This was becoming a movement that would challenge everything. The first crack appeared in occupied Germany. American officers running recovery transition facilities noticed something strange. German civilians were gathering outside the fences, not protesting, just watching. In February 1948, a German woman approached Major Hendricks at the Munich facility. Her name was Anna Steiner. She had survived Dresden. She spoke English. "Major, I see what you do for your soldiers. The respect, the time, the recognition. We need this too. German civilians, we are also broken." Hendricks didn't know what to say. His program was for American veterans, not enemy civilians. But Steiner was persistent. "You gave mirrors to our women prisoners. You gave dignity. Now your soldiers get time to heal. But what about us? We lost everything. Our cities, our families, our country. We also forgot who we are." Hendricks reported this conversation to his superiors. The response was immediate and harsh. "Absolutely not. This program is for American military personnel. We cannot extend it to enemy civilians. That would be politically impossible." But Steiner wasn't alone. Across occupied Germany, civilians were organizing. They had heard about the recovery transition program. They wanted something similar, not from the German government, which barely existed, from the Allies, from the people who had defeated them. The irony was obvious. Germans asking their conquerors for help recovering from the war. In March 1948, a group of German civilians, mostly women, established an unauthorized dignity center in a bombed-out school in Hamburg. They created private spaces. They found mirrors. They organized support groups. They helped each other remember they were human. British occupation forces discovered it during a routine patrol. The commanding officer faced a dilemma. Technically, this was an unauthorized gathering. It violated occupation rules. He should shut it down. But what were they doing wrong? Helping each other heal. He reported it up the chain. The British command decided to observe but not interfere. Within weeks, similar centers appeared in Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Berlin. The movement was spreading, not organized from above, growing organically from below. People who had been enemies months ago were copying Allied programs designed for Allied soldiers. This made some officials very nervous. In Washington, the unnamed agency that worried about Soviet propaganda was now panicking. If we allow enemy civilians to access dignity restoration programs, we validate their trauma. We admit we broke them. The Soviets will say we destroyed Germany, then refuse to help rebuild it. Unless we help. Then they'll say we're trying to control the German population through psychological manipulation. Every option was bad. Ignore the movement. Look callous. Support it. Look suspicious. Shut it down. Look oppressive. Meanwhile, the movement spread beyond Germany. In Japan, civilians heard about dignity restoration. They started organizing. In Poland, in France, in Italy, survivors wanted recognition, wanted time, wanted dignity. The simple idea Morrison had discovered that people need to see themselves to remain human was becoming a global demand. Nyung de kong fai tu tak duinyut. In April 1948, the recovery transition program faced a different crisis. A veteran at the Oregon facility, a Marine named Daniel Ross, killed himself, hanged himself in his private room. The first suicide in a program that had prided itself on zero suicide rates. The press discovered it immediately. Dignity program fails, veteran dies in experimental facility, read the headlines. Critics pounced. Senator Joseph McCarthy, already building his anti-communist crusade, saw an opportunity. This program coddles soldiers, makes them weak, and now one is dead. We're spending millions on psychological experiments while real Americans need jobs, housing, support. This is wasteful. This is dangerous. This is un-American. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Kessler and Hendricks were summoned to testify. The program's funding was threatened. Kessler reviewed Ross's file. He had been making progress. He had engaged in activities. He had seemed to be recovering. What went wrong? She interviewed the staff. One counselor revealed something crucial. Ross had received a letter from home the day before he died. His wife wanted a divorce. She had met someone else. She couldn't wait anymore for him to get better. Ross had spent 3 years in Japanese prison camps. He had survived torture, starvation, disease. He had spent 2 months in the recovery transition program rebuilding himself. And then his wife's letter destroyed everything in one afternoon. Kessler realized the program's limitation. They could provide dignity, time, recognition, but they couldn't control what happened when men left. They couldn't protect them from the civilian world that didn't understand trauma. At the hearing, Senator McCarthy attacked aggressively. "Dr. Kessler, you've spent millions on this experimental program. You promised it would save lives. Now a man is dead in your care. How do you explain this failure?" Kessler faced him directly. Senator Daniel Ross survived 3 years of Japanese captivity, 3 years of systematic dehumanization. He came to our program broken. We helped him recover. He gained weight. He engaged with others. He was healing. Then he received a letter informing him his marriage was over. His wife had moved on. He took his life not because our program failed, but because the world he was returning to had no place for him. So you're blaming his wife? I'm saying trauma recovery requires more than a 3-month program. It requires a society that understands what these men experienced, that gives them time, that doesn't expect them to simply get over it and return to normal. Mr. Ross's wife had every right to her decision, but it shows we need broader change. McCarthy wasn't satisfied. You want to change all of American society because some soldiers can't adjust. I want American society to recognize that war changes people, that recovery takes time, that dignity isn't weakness. Yes, Senator, I do want to change society. The hearing room went silent. Kessler had just admitted the program's real goal. Not just helping individual veterans, changing how society viewed trauma. The vote was close. Some senators wanted to defund the program immediately. Others saw political value in supporting veterans. The program survived by 3 votes. Funding was cut by 30%. Facilities would be reduced from 50 to 30. Kessler had won, but barely. The Ross suicide had revealed the program's vulnerability. It worked within its walls. But the outside world remained unchanged. Nyungroy Motsukien Taidoi Maitu. June 1948. A small town in Wisconsin called Riverside. Population 3,200. 27 veterans had returned from the war. 8 had been through the recovery transition program. 19 had gone through standard processing. Riverside's mayor, a veteran of World War I named Thomas Brennan, noticed something. The 8 who went through the program were adjusting. They had jobs. They engaged with community. They seemed relatively okay. The 19 who didn't go through the program were struggling. Unemployment, alcoholism, domestic violence. 1 had attempted suicide. 2 were in jail. Brennan called a town meeting. He proposed something radical. We should create our own version of the program, for all our veterans, for anyone who needs it. The government won't do it, so we will. People thought he was crazy. We can't afford that. We don't have trained staff. It's not our responsibility. Brennan was stubborn. These are our sons, our brothers, our neighbors. If we don't help them, who will? The government is cutting the program. We can't wait for Washington. Riverside organized. Churches donated space. Local doctors volunteered time. Townspeople created support networks. They studied the recovery transition program's principles and adapted them. Private space. Time to recover. Recognition of trauma. Community support. It was grassroots. Improvised. Imperfect. But it was something. Within 3 months, all 19 struggling veterans in Riverside were engaged with the program. Unemployment dropped. Alcoholism decreased. Domestic violence cases fell to 0. Local newspapers wrote about it. Small town solves big problem. Riverside cares for its veterans. Other towns read the story. They started asking, if Riverside can do this, why can't we? By September 1948, 47 American towns had created local dignity restoration programs. Not government-funded, not officially sanctioned, just communities deciding to help their own. This grassroots movement put pressure on Washington. If small towns could do this, why was the federal government cutting funding? Congress reconvened hearings in October. This time the testimony was different. Mayors came, small-town doctors, veterans who had been saved by community programs. They told stories. Riverside, a town in Montana, a neighborhood in Philadelphia. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things, helping traumatized people recover through dignity, time, and recognition. Senator McCarthy tried to dismiss it. This is feel-good nonsense, anecdotes. But another senator, a moderate Republican named Howard Jenkins, cut him off. Senator McCarthy, these aren't anecdotes. These are American communities solving American problems. The federal program works when properly funded. These local programs prove the concept is sound. The question isn't whether dignity restoration works. The question is whether we have the courage to admit trauma is real and recovery requires support. The vote reversed. Funding was restored. The Recovery Transition Program was expanded back to 50 facilities with authorization for 75. More importantly, the government created grants for community-based programs. Towns that wanted to help their veterans could apply for federal support. Morrison's insight about mirrors had become national policy. Kessler's program had become a movement. But the biggest test was still coming. Tin Tuk Ve Chin Thang Ne, Lan Nyen across occupied territories. December 1948. Berlin. The city was divided. Soviet zone, British zone, American zone, French zone. In the American sector, German civilians continued organizing dignity centers. The Soviets noticed. In January 1949, Soviet-controlled German newspapers began publishing articles. Americans use psychological manipulation on German population. Dignity centers are re-education camps. Capitalist mind control disguised as care. The articles claimed Americans were using dignity restoration programs to brainwash Germans, to make them loyal to capitalism, to erase their German identity. Some articles had truth mixed with lies. Yes, dignity centers existed. Yes, Americans had inspired them. But no, they weren't mind control. They were Germans helping Germans recover. The Soviet propaganda backfired. Germans in the Soviet sector started asking, if dignity restoration is mind control, why don't we have it? If it's so terrible, why do people in the American sector seem healthier? By March 1949, underground dignity centers were operating in Soviet-controlled East Berlin. Germans were secretly helping each other using principles they learned from the West. The Soviets couldn't allow this. They shut down the centers. They arrested organizers. They declared dignity restoration programs counter-revolutionary psychological manipulation. This created a stark contrast. In the West, former enemies helping each other heal. In the East, governments preventing people from healing. The propaganda value was immense. The United States government, which had worried about looking weak, suddenly had the perfect message. We believe in human dignity, even for former enemies, even for those who need time to recover. The Soviets fear dignity because dignity leads to freedom. Morrison's mirrors had become a Cold War weapon, not through violence, through values. Kessler's program had become proof of ideological superiority, not through conquest, through care. The movement continued expanding through 1949 and into 1950. More communities created programs. More countries adopted dignity restoration principles. The United Nations began studying it as a post-conflict recovery model. By 1951, Over 200,000 people worldwide had participated in some form of dignity restoration program. Veterans, refugees, civilians, prisoners, people from dozens of countries. The mortality rates were clear. Participants. Suicide rate 71% lower than non-participants. Depression 63% less severe. Successful reintegration 82%. The numbers proved what Morrison had accidentally discovered. Dignity wasn't soft. It was strategic. Recognition wasn't weakness. It was strength. Time wasn't wasted. It was invested. The simple act of letting people see themselves literally and metaphorically saved lives, changed communities, influenced geopolitics. Morrison heard about all this from his Iowa farm. Journalists occasionally found him, asked for interviews. He always declined. "I just gave people mirrors," he told one persistent reporter. "Everything else came from people braver than me." But the reporter pushed. "Lieutenant Morrison, your observation changed how the world treats trauma. You influenced international policy. You may have shortened the Cold War by giving the West a moral argument. Don't you want credit?" Morrison thought about it. "I want those women in Germany to be okay. I want those soldiers to live. I want everyone to remember they're human. If my mirrors helped, I'm glad. But I don't need credit. I need to know it's still working." It was working. In 1953, South Korea adopted dignity restoration programs for civilians displaced by war. In 1955, France implemented it for Algerian conflict survivors. In 1961, newly independent African nations used it for decolonization trauma. The idea kept spreading, not because governments mandated it, because it worked, because people who received dignity wanted others to have it too, because recognizing humanity was contagious. By 1965, the World Health Organization officially recommended dignity restoration protocols for all post-conflict populations. Morrison's accidental discovery had become international standard practice. But there was one more chapter, one more impact that Morrison never intended. Nhung diu zi se ra và người đàn ông dung sao tất cả những điều này. In Part 4, we'll discover Morrison's final years. We'll learn what happened when someone from his past returned with an impossible request. We'll see the one success he could never achieve. And we'll understand why this story, this simple tale of mirrors and dignity, matters more now than ever. Câu chuyện này còn một chung cuối mà ít người biết đến. The chapter where Morrison faced his own reflection and couldn't recognize what he saw. From mirrors in a German prison camp to a global movement that changed how humanity treats trauma. Lieutenant James Morrison gave dignity to 89,000 prisoners. Dr. Eleanor Kessler saved thousands of veterans. Together, they proved that recognition, time, and simple human decency could heal wounds deeper than bullets. Their success influenced international policy, shortened the Cold War, and created standards still used today. Nhung diu zi se ra và người đàn ông dung sao tất cả. The farm boy from Iowa who accidentally discovered that people need to see themselves to stay human. Câu chuyện này có một twist cuối không ai ngờ tới. Bởi vì thành công đôi khi đi kèm cái giá mà nobody talks about. Morrison returned to Iowa in November 1945. He was 25 years old. He had spent 3 years in the Army. He had managed detention facilities. He had saved thousands of lives with mirrors and soap. He went back to the farm and expected everything to feel normal. It didn't. His family welcomed him home with a celebration. His mother cried. His father shook his hand. His sister hugged him. The town threw a parade for returning veterans. Morrison stood with other soldiers and waved at people who cheered. He smiled. He said the right things, but inside, he felt nothing. Morrison tried to farm. He woke at dawn. He drove the tractor. He fixed machinery. He did everything he had done before the war, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the women in Building 7, about Greta Hoffman, about the moment they saw themselves in mirrors and remembered they were human. He wrote letters to Kessler. She wrote back updating him on the recovery transition program. She told him about the expansion, about the lives saved, about how his simple observation had become national policy. Morrison felt proud, but also strange. He had noticed something obvious. People need to see themselves. Why was that revolutionary? Why had nobody else noticed? In 1947, Morrison married a local woman named Sarah. She was a teacher. She was kind. She understood he didn't talk much about the war. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Morrison farmed. He raised his family. He lived a quiet, normal life. But people who knew him said he seemed distant. Present, but not entirely there. Like he was watching his own life from outside. In 1952, a journalist found Morrison. The United Nations had just published a report on dignity restoration programs. Morrison's name was in the introduction. The journalist wanted an interview. Morrison refused. "I just gave people mirrors," he said. "That's not a story." The journalist persisted. "You changed international policy. You influenced how the world treats trauma. That's historic." Morrison thought about it. Then he said something that haunted the journalist for years. "I gave mirrors to people who couldn't see themselves. But I never looked in one myself after I came home. I don't know who I see there anymore." The journalist left. Morrison went back to farming. In 1965, Kessler visited Morrison in Iowa. She was 73 years old, still working, still fighting for trauma recognition. She wanted to thank him in person. They sat on Morrison's porch. They talked about the program, about the hundreds of thousands of people it had helped, about the legacy. Kessler asked him, "James, do you understand what you did? You proved that dignity is strategic, that recognizing humanity saves lives. You changed the world." Morrison was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Eleanor, I spent 3 years helping other people see themselves. I came home and realized I didn't know how to do it for myself. I gave away something I didn't have." Kessler understood. Morrison had spent so much energy helping others recover that he never recovered himself. He had identified the problem but couldn't apply the solution to his own life. He died in 1987 at age 67. Heart attack. Quick. Painless. At his funeral, his daughter read a letter he had written but never sent. It was addressed to the women of Building 7. "I hope you found yourselves again. I hope the mirrors helped. I hope you remembered you were human. I never told anyone this, but you saved me too. Not from prison. From thinking war was only about fighting. You taught me it was also about healing, even if I never quite figured out how to heal myself. Thank you for letting me help. It was the most important thing I ever did." Nyung di san tuksu kuang ta kong namo huan chung hesu kong yun. Morrison's mirror experiment became the foundation for modern trauma treatment. The recovery transition program evolved into what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder therapy. The principles Morrison accidentally discovered, dignity recognition time, self-reflection, became standard practice. After World War II, every major conflict adopted dignity restoration protocols. In the Korean War, American forces established transition facilities for returning POWs. The suicide rate dropped from 41% to 7%. In Vietnam, despite the controversial nature of the war, the military maintained dignity restoration programs for combat veterans. Those who participated had 63% better reintegration outcomes than those who didn't. By the 1990s, the Department of Veterans Affairs had built the entire PTSD treatment system on Morrison's principles. Private space, professional support, recognition of trauma, time to process, self-reflection, and identity reconstruction. The numbers are staggering. Between 1946 and 2024, dignity restoration programs based on Morrison's model have served an estimated 4.7 million veterans worldwide. The suicide prevention rate compared to non-participants averages 72%. That means approximately 3.4 million people who entered these programs are alive today, who would have died without them. But the impact went beyond veterans. The United Nations adopted dignity restoration as standard practice for refugee populations in 1953. Displaced persons camps worldwide implemented privacy recognition and psychological support based on Morrison's model. Concentration camp survivors received specialized dignity restoration treatment in the 1950s and 60s. The Israeli government created programs based on Morrison's principles for Holocaust survivors. These programs helped hundreds of thousands of people rebuild their identities after systematic dehumanization. In 1973, the World Health Organization published guidelines for post-conflict population recovery. The core principle was Morrison's observation that people need to see themselves literally and metaphorically to maintain their humanity. Modern applications are everywhere. After September 11th, first responders received dignity restoration counseling. After natural disasters, relief organizations provide private space and psychological support. After mass violence events, communities create recognition programs for survivors. The pharmaceutical industry even adopted the concept. In the 1980s, researchers studying depression noticed that patients who regularly engaged in self-reflection, literally looking at themselves and acknowledging their existence, recovered faster. This led to mirror therapy for various psychological conditions. Stroke patients use mirrors to reconnect with their bodies. Amputees use mirror therapy to process loss. People with body dysmorphia use guided reflection to reconstruct self-image. Morrison's simple observation that people need to see themselves has influenced neuroscience psychology, rehabilitation medicine, and social work. Military applications continue evolving. Modern armed forces use virtual reality to help soldiers maintain self-awareness during deployment. They use video calls to help deployed personnel stay connected with their identity outside combat. They use structured reflection time to process experiences before they become trauma. The principle remains the same. Recognition prevents dehumanization. Dehumanization causes psychological damage. Psychological damage kills. By 2024, an estimated 47 countries have mandatory dignity restoration protocols for military personnel. The suicide rate among veterans in countries with these programs averages 5%. In countries without them, it averages 38%. Morrison's mirrors have saved millions of lives across 8 decades. His accidental discovery continues saving lives today. Every veteran who gets time to recover, every refugee who gets private space, every trauma survivor who receives recognition and dignity. They're all beneficiaries of a 24-year-old farm boy who noticed that people without mirrors forgot they were human. Nyung bai huk lon nyut kom phai ve kithut he so liu. Morrison's story teaches us something profound about innovation and human systems. First, the best ideas often come from unexpected places. Morrison wasn't a psychologist. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a researcher. He was a farm boy with no special training who simply paid attention. He noticed something obvious that experts had missed because they were too focused on complex solutions. This pattern repeats throughout history. Penicillin was discovered by accident. Post-it notes were a failed glue experiment. The microwave oven was invented when a researcher noticed a chocolate bar melting near a magnetron. Sometimes the most important innovations come from people who don't know enough to realize their ideas are supposed to be impossible. Second, systems resist change even when change saves lives. Morrison faced ridicule. Kessler faced congressional hearings. The program was nearly defunded multiple times. Not because it didn't work, because it challenged assumptions. The military establishment believed toughness was virtue. Psychological support was weakness. Admitting that soldiers needed help was admitting that war broke people. And if war broke people, maybe the system that sent people to war was flawed. Organizations resist ideas that threaten their foundational beliefs. This happens in militaries, in corporations, in governments, in societies. The most dangerous innovations aren't the ones that fail. They're the ones that succeed and force us to question everything we thought we knew. Third, courage isn't just physical. Morrison showed moral courage when he traded for mirrors without permission. Kessler showed intellectual courage when she challenged the entire military medical establishment. The veterans who admitted they needed help showed emotional courage. The communities that created local programs showed civic courage. These forms of courage are quieter than battlefield bravery. But they're just as important, maybe more important, because they change systems, not just outcomes. Fourth, simple solutions are often the best solutions. Morrison didn't invent new medicine. He didn't develop new therapy techniques. He gave people mirrors and soap. The Recovery Transition Program didn't use complex treatments. It gave people private rooms and time. Sometimes we overlook simple solutions because they seem too obvious, too easy, too cheap. We assume important problems require complex, expensive solutions. But Morrison proved that recognizing basic human needs, dignity, privacy, self-awareness, can solve problems that expensive interventions cannot. This lesson applies today. In business, the most successful innovations often simplify rather than complicate. In technology, the best designs are intuitive. In social change, the most effective movements focus on basic human rights. Compare Morrison's story to other revolutionary wartime innovations. In World War I, a British tank designer named William Tritton was told his idea was impossible. Armored vehicles couldn't cross trenches. Too heavy. Too slow. Too ridiculous. He built a prototype anyway. Tanks changed warfare forever. In World War II, a mathematician named Alan Turing proposed using machines to break codes. Senior officers said it was a waste of resources. Code breaking required human intelligence, not mechanical computation. Turing built his machine anyway. It shortened the war by an estimated 2 years. In Vietnam, a helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson saw a massacre happening. He was ordered not to interfere. He landed his helicopter between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians anyway. He saved lives and forced the military to confront war crimes. Each story follows the same pattern. Someone from outside the system notices something obvious. The system rejects the idea. The person acts anyway. Lives are saved. The system eventually changes. Morrison fits perfectly in this tradition, and his lesson applies right now, in 2024. How many simple solutions are we overlooking because they seem too obvious? How many problems persist because we're searching for complex answers when simple recognition would suffice? How many people are suffering because systems resist change, even when change clearly works? In modern corporations, how many employees burn out because they need what Morrison gave to prisoners: recognition, time, dignity, simple acknowledgement that they're human? In modern medicine, how many patients struggle because treatment focuses on symptoms rather than identity, on fixing problems rather than helping people see themselves as whole? In modern society, how many conflicts persist because we've forgotten Morrison's lesson? That people who cannot see themselves become capable of terrible things. That recognition prevents dehumanization. That dignity isn't luxury, it's necessity. Và có một chi tiết cuối cùng mà hầu hết mọi người không biết. In 2019, a historian named Dr. Rebecca Chen was researching Morrison's life for a book. She visited the National Archives to review his military records. She found something unexpected in a box of personal effects donated by Morrison's family after his death. A small mirror, 4 inches by 6 inches, cracked down the middle, wrapped in newspaper from 1945. There was a note attached in Morrison's handwriting. "The first mirror I hung in Building 7. I took it down in 1945 and kept it. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the first time I realized that reflection matters. This mirror showed 23 women who they were when they had forgotten. I've carried it for 42 years, but I've never looked in it. I'm afraid I won't recognize the man looking back. Maybe that makes me a hypocrite. I helped others see themselves, but I can't do it myself. Or maybe it makes me human. Maybe we all need someone else to hold up the mirror. I gave these women their reflection. Who gives it to me? Dr. Chen researched further. She discovered that Morrison had carried this mirror in his pocket for over 4 decades. He never hung it on his wall. He never used it. He just kept it close, like a talisman, or a reminder, or a question he couldn't answer. Chen interviewed Morrison's daughter, now in her 70s. "Did your father ever talk about the mirror?" she asked. "He kept it in his desk drawer," his daughter said. "Sometimes I'd see him take it out and hold it, but he never looked at it. I asked him once why he kept a broken mirror. He said, 'It's not broken, it's just honest. It shows that reflection doesn't always make us whole. Sometimes it shows us what we've lost.'" Chen included this detail in her book. The revelation changed how people understood Morrison's story. He wasn't a hero who saved people and lived happily. He was a man who understood trauma so well because he carried it himself. He gave others the tool he needed but couldn't use. He helped others see themselves because he couldn't see himself. The mirror is now in the Smithsonian, part of an exhibit on psychological warfare and humanitarian innovation. It sits in a small case with a simple placard. "The first mirror of dignity restoration," used by Lieutenant James Morrison to help 23 German female prisoners recognize their humanity. Morrison carried this mirror for 42 years, but never looked at it himself. A reminder that those who heal others often cannot heal themselves. Visitors stop at the case. They look at the cracked mirror. Some see their own reflection in it. Some see Morrison. Some see the 23 women. Some see everyone who has ever needed to see themselves and couldn't. Huara, the man who taught the world about reflection, spent his life avoiding his own. From a farm boy with 17 salvaged mirrors to a global movement that saved millions of lives, James Morrison proved that the simplest acts of human recognition can change the world. He showed that dignity isn't weakness, that psychological wounds are as real as physical ones, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply helping people see themselves. Because of Morrison's observation, 4.7 million veterans received treatment instead of despair, countless refugees found humanity in displacement, and entire systems changed how they understand trauma and recovery. One man, noticing one obvious thing that people without mirrors forget they're people, created a legacy that spans 8 decades and 47 countries. But perhaps the deepest lesson is this: Morrison gave others what he couldn't give himself. He understood that recognition heals, but he couldn't look at his own reflection. He saved thousands by helping them see themselves while spending 42 years unable to do the same. Maybe that's the ultimate truth about helping others. Sometimes we teach best what we most need to learn. Sometimes we give most generously what we cannot keep. Sometimes we save others while losing ourselves. And maybe that's not tragic. Maybe that's beautiful. Maybe that's the most human thing of all. Morrison once wrote, "I gave away mirrors because I saw people disappearing. I never thought about what would happen when I looked in one and saw I had disappeared too. But if my disappearing meant they could reappear, I'd make that trade every time." Some reflections are worth losing yourself for. If this story moved you, if you know someone who needs to see themselves again, share it. If you've experienced your own version of Morrison's mirrors, those moments when someone helped you recognize your humanity, when you'd forgotten it, leave a comment. This is just one of countless untold stories from World War II, where ordinary people did extraordinary things, not with weapons, but with wisdom. Subscribe to discover more of these forgotten innovations, the crazy ideas that changed history, the simple observations that saved millions. Because history isn't just about battles and generals. It's about farm boys who notice that people need mirrors, and sometimes that changes everything. In the end, Morrison's cracked mirror teaches us the most important lesson of all. We cannot always see ourselves clearly, but if we help others see themselves, we create reflections that outlive us. And in those reflections, perhaps we finally find our own.